"Pretend to be my mate," ordered the Alpha King, but her heart stopped at his one condition. The wind howled through the jagged cliffs of Veloria, carrying with it a chill that seemed older than time itself. From the blackened peaks to the endless forests below, whispers of an immortal king spread through villages and towns alike. He was called Veyron, the Alpha King, ruler of shadows and keeper of cursed lands. Some said his heart was as cold as the stone of his castle, yet others whispered of a loneliness so deep that it could drown the bravest souls who dared to meet his gaze. Far from the palace, in a small, crumbling cottage at the edge of a quiet village, Lyra Sarath stared into the fire. Her hands trembled slightly as she traced the edges of an old parchment, prophecies she had been trying to escape for years. She was a seer, one who could glimpse threads of the future that others could not. For that gift, she had been exiled, branded dangerous, and feared. Her visions had warned her countless times that the Alpha King's path would cross hers, and that it would not end lightly. Tonight, the wind carried a different tone. There was a summons, an invisible pull she could not resist. The flames flickered wildly, casting shadows that danced like living creatures. And then, as if the shadows themselves had spoken, the air shifted. A cold, commanding voice echoed in her mind, though no one had entered her cottage. "Lyra Sarath, come to me!" Her heart thudded painfully. She knew that voice; it belonged to Kale, to the immortal king who could bend men and magic to his will. Her mind screamed to run, to hide, to vanish, but her feet did not obey. She felt as though invisible chains guided her, pulling her toward a destiny she had spent her life trying to escape. By the time she reached the towering gates of the Obsidian Palace, the moon had risen high, pale and silver against the dark sky. The palace itself was a fortress of shadows and stone, rising like a jagged crown above the cliffs. Guards clad in black armor with masks like wolf skulls flanked the gates. They did not speak, only bowed, acknowledging her arrival with silent respect or fear. She felt the weight of the prophecy pressing against her chest. Inside, the corridors were alive with whispers of old magic. The air was thick with power, ancient and unyielding, and yet beneath it there was something human, fragile, aching, and lonely. Lyra's steps echoed as she followed a trail of torchlight until she reached the throne room where Kale waited. He sat upon a throne carved from black stone and bone, his presence so commanding it seemed to bend the shadows around him. His eyes, dark and piercing, met hers, and a strange heat stirred within her chest despite the chill in the air. Kale Veyron was not just a king. He was a force of nature, both terrifying and magnetic. "You have come," he said, his voice low and steady, carrying authority that made her knees ache with both fear and anticipation. "Ah, yes," she stammered. The words sounded fragile in the vast room. "You summoned me?" Kale rose, a predator moving with elegance and danger. He circled her slowly as if studying her, weighing every thought and heartbeat. "I did, and now you will help me." "Help you?" Lyra asked, her voice quivering. She had expected commands, perhaps even punishment, but not this. The tension in the room was palpable, thick like the mist that covered the cliffs outside. Kale stopped, standing before her. His eyes softened just slightly, though the power in his gaze never wavered. "There is a rebellion. It threatens both the mortal and immortal realms. To protect my kingdom and your world, you will pretend." Lyra frowned, confusion mingling with fear. "Pretend? Pretend what?" "To be my mate," Kale said simply, the words echoing in the high, vaulted room. "Only for appearances. Only to calm the unrest and stabilize the magic of Veloria." Her heart froze. The prophecy had warned of a bond forged in darkness, one that demanded sacrifice and courage beyond mortal measure. She had hoped it could be avoided, that she could remain a distant observer in the tide of fate, but the Alpha King's presence made that impossible. I cannot," she whispered, shaking her head. I'm mortal. I'm not capable of this." Kale's expression hardened, though his voice remained steady. "You do not have a choice. The threads of fate have led you here. The prophecy brought you to me, and now it requires your obedience for your own survival and the survival of all you hold dear." The weight of his words pressed down on her like stone. She wanted to resist, to claim her autonomy, but every instinct told her that to defy him here was to invite ruin. Yet even in that fear, a spark of defiance burned within her. She would not be a pawn without question. "And there is one condition," Kale continued, his tone dropping to a whisper that seemed to echo in her bones. To be my mate, you must willingly enter the shadow binding, a ritual that entwines your life with mine. Once it begins, there is no turning back. Lyra's chest tightened. The shadow binding was more than a mere ritual. It was a dangerous magic that connected two souls, intertwining their fates and hearts. It was feared even among immortals for its intensity and unpredictability. Her mind raced, imagining the consequences, the loss of freedom, the danger to her life, the possible pain that could follow. She faltered. I don't know if I can. Cale's gaze softened, revealing a rare glimpse of vulnerability. I will guide you, he said, stepping closer. But the choice, the willingness must come from you. The power of the bond depends on consent. If you resist, it could destroy us both. Lyra swallowed hard. The intensity of the moment made her pulse thunder in her ears. The prophecy, the summons, the dangers, all of it converged into a single point of decision. Her future, the king's world, and perhaps even her own survival depended on her answer. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. I need time. Cale's expression remained unreadable, yet the faintest trace of a smile touched his lips. Time is a luxury you do not have, he said. The ritual begins at dawn. You will make your choice before then. Until that moment, I will not force you, but you will remain here within my palace. Lyra's mind reeled as she was led through shadowed corridors to a chamber that overlooked the cliffs and the dark forests beyond. The room was sparse yet elegant, filled with the faint scent of old magic and stone. She stared out at the horizon, her thoughts a storm of fear, fascination, and inevitability. She wondered about the man who had summoned her, the immortal king with a haunted soul. His power was undeniable, yet she sensed loneliness in him deeper than the abyss itself. Was it possible that even a creature as fearsome as Cale Veyron could long for connection? Night deepened, and the stars blinked coldly above. Lyra could not sleep. Every shadow seemed to move, every whisper of the wind a voice calling her name. She thought of the shadow binding, of the danger it posed, and yet a strange curiosity stirred within her. To stand beside the Alpha King, even for pretense, was to glimpse a world she had never known, one of power, secrets, and dark beauty. When the first hint of dawn touched the palace walls, Cale appeared at her door. He was calm, yet the energy in the room shifted, electric and heavy with unspoken tension. The time has come, he said softly. You must decide. Lyra's hands shook as she rose to meet him. The vastness of her fear met the depth of her fascination, and in that moment she understood the truth. Her life would never be hers again. She could only choose how much of it she would give to the darkness and to him. Cale extended his hand, not in command, but as an invitation. Will you enter the shadow binding with me? Lyra's heart pounded. She felt the pull of destiny, the weight of prophecy, and the heat of an emotion she could not name. With a trembling breath, she lifted her hand toward his, aware that whatever choice she made now would change the course of both their lives forever. And then she heard it, the faintest echo, a whisper in the shadows of the room, like a warning from the past. The shadow binding waited, patient and inevitable, ready to claim what it was owed. Her hand hovered, trembling in the space between them, as if caught between light and darkness. And in that instant, her heart stopped, not from fear, but from the realization of what was about to begin. The Alpha King waited, silent and patient, his gaze locked onto hers. Whatever choice she made, the world of Veloria and her own heart would never be the same again. And so, with the first light of dawn brushing the obsidian spires of the palace, the stage was set. Fate had arrived, and it demanded its due. Dawn broke over the obsidian spires of Veloria, spilling pale light into the vast throne room. The first hints of morning failed to chase away the shadows clinging to the walls, and the air hummed with an invisible energy that made Lyra's skin prickle. The day of the shadow binding had arrived. Lyra Sarath stood at the center of the chamber, her heart hammering in her chest. The floor beneath her was carved with intricate symbols, ancient runes that glimmered faintly as if alive. Each line pulsed with magic older than Veloria itself. Cale Veyron stood opposite her, calm and commanding, yet there was a subtle tension in the set of his shoulders, a flicker in his eyes that betrayed a rare uncertainty. The ritual begins, Cale said, his voice smooth but edged with a sharp intensity. Do not fear it. Let the magic guide you, but never forget. The shadow binding demands honesty, courage, and willingness. Lyra swallowed hard. She had prepared for fear, but not for fascination. Cale's presence, even across the room, was overwhelming. His eyes, dark as midnight, seemed to see not just her body but the core of her being, the thoughts she did not speak aloud, the fears she had tried to hide. The first step of the ritual required them to touch, to place their palms together across the rune circle. Lyra's hand trembled as she reached out. The moment her skin brushed Kale's, a shock of warmth and cold at once surged through her. It was as if fire and ice had met inside her veins, and she gasped, stumbling slightly backward. Kale's hand stayed steady, grounding her. "Breathe," he murmured. "Let the magic flow, do not resist." Her eyes met his. In that gaze, she saw something she had not expected, not just power, but fragility. Even a king could fear losing what he valued most. The thought made her pulse quicken, a strange mixture of fear and empathy threading through her. Taking a deep breath, Lyra pressed her palm fully against Kale's. A ripple of energy coursed between them, invisible but undeniable. The runes at their feet glowed brighter, casting a shifting light that danced over the walls like living shadows. Whispers, soft and unintelligible, brushed against Lyra's ears. She felt memories that were not her own flicker in her mind, visions of kings long past, of battles fought, and of loneliness so deep it ached like a wound that never healed. "Do you see it?" Kale asked, his voice low. "The shadow binding shows you your truths. Face them and you will survive it." Lyra clenched her fists. The visions that came were not gentle. She saw herself alone in a world where no one understood her, running from powers she could not control. She saw Kale trapped by his own immortality, a king feared by all, even by those he ruled. For a brief moment she understood the weight of his loneliness. And then, just as quickly, the shadows swirled into darkness, almost swallowing her whole. She stumbled back, gasping. Kale's hand caught hers again, steady and firm. "Do not be afraid," he said. "The visions will pass if you trust yourself and me." Lyra's chest heaved. Trust, that word felt foreign and fragile. She had trusted few in her life, and the ones she had lost had left scars on her heart. Yet here, in the presence of a king who could crush kingdoms with a word, she felt a strange safety in his touch, a promise unspoken. The second step of the ritual required words, oaths spoken aloud to bind their spirits together. Kale knelt slightly, lowering himself so that their eyes met, and Lyra felt the world shrink to just the two of them. "Do you choose to enter this bond willingly?" he asked, his voice reverent now, as if speaking to something sacred. Lyra's mind raced. Every instinct screamed caution, every vision she had ever seen warning her of danger. And yet there was a pull she could not deny, an invisible thread tying her to him, stronger than fear. She swallowed hard and whispered, I will try. I choose to try." The words were small, tentative, but the power behind them surged through the chamber. Light flared from the runes at their feet, wrapping them in an ethereal glow. Lyra felt the magic seep into her veins, mingling with her heartbeat, binding her essence to Kale's in ways both terrifying and intoxicating. The shadow binding was not instant. It moved slowly, like a living thing, testing, probing, challenging. Lyra felt every heartbeat of Kale as if it were her own. She sensed his doubts, his fears, and his burdens. The longer they remained in contact, the deeper her understanding of him became, and the more dangerous it felt. To love a man so powerful could mean losing herself entirely. Kale's voice broke the silence. "Do not fear me," he said softly. "Fear the shadows within you, not me." Lyra shook her head. "I do not know how to separate the shadows from the truth." He reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "Then let me guide you," he murmured. His touch was gentle, almost tender, and it carried with it an unexpected warmth. For a moment, Lyra allowed herself to believe that perhaps this bond could be more than survival. It could be connection, understanding, even something that resembled hope. But the shadows of the binding were relentless. As the ritual deepened, Lyra's visions grew darker. She saw the cost of failure. Herself lost to the void, Kale consumed by the loneliness he had carried for centuries, the kingdom falling into chaos. Every failure, every mistake was amplified in the visions, showing her not only what could happen to her, but what could happen to everyone she had ever cared for. Tears pricked her eyes. The burden was overwhelming, and for the first time she felt the fear of giving herself completely to another. Yet Kale's presence remained steadfast, a pillar of strength she could cling to. "You are stronger than you think," he said. "Even in the shadow, even in fear, you are strong. Believe in that strength." Lyra drew in a deep breath, her fingers tightening around his. She felt the warmth of his life, steady and alive, flowing into her. The shadows swirled around them, pressing in, yet somehow together they withstood it. She realized then that the shadow binding was not only a test of magic, but a test of trust, courage, and heart. Hours passed like minutes. The sun climbed higher, but the light outside did not touch them. Within the glow of the runes, Lyra and Cale remained entwined, each learning the rhythm of the other, each discovering the fragility and strength that lay beneath the surface. Every heartbeat shared, every touch, every whispered word became a lifeline. And yet, even as they grew closer, even as the tension between them began to shift from fear to something softer, something unspoken, danger lingered. The magic of the shadow binding had a will of its own. It tested them, not with mere illusions, but with emotional truths they could not hide. Lyra saw Cale's loneliness as clearly as she saw her own fear. She understood, in a way she had never understood before, why the prophecy had singled her for this moment. She could meet the darkness within him and within herself. She could survive it, and perhaps, in doing so, help him survive as well. But the magic was not done. A sudden surge of shadow flared around them, stronger and more violent than before. Lyra cried out as the vision struck her full force. A nightmarish vision of the palace burning, of Cale falling into darkness, of her own body crumpled and cold. She felt as if the shadows were reaching into her chest, squeezing her heart, testing the bond's limits. Cale's eyes widened as he reacted instantly, drawing a protective shield around them, forcing the shadows back. "Hold on," he commanded, his voice carrying the raw authority of centuries. "Do not let it take you." Lyra pressed herself against him, the warmth of his body grounding her. She closed her eyes and focused on his heartbeat, the strength in his presence, the promise of connection. Slowly, the shadows began to recede, unable to withstand their combined will. When she opened her eyes again, she found him watching her with a softness she had not seen before. "You endured," he said, his voice almost tender. "You survived what could have broken others. That is strength beyond any magic." Her chest heaved with exhaustion, relief, and a strange thrill she could not name. The bond was not complete, not yet. The shadow binding still pulsed around them, alive, demanding patience, courage, and trust. But for the first time, Lyra felt that maybe, just maybe, they could succeed. Cale stepped closer, lowering his hand to brush against hers. "You have passed the first trial," he said, voice quiet yet powerful. "But the true challenge is yet to come. The bond will ask more of you, and the shadows will not relent." Lyra's heart pounded. She had faced the first step, but she knew this was only the beginning. The deeper layers of the binding, the intertwining of their hearts and fates, awaited. She had glimpsed the cost, and yet the pull toward him, toward the connection that defied fear and prophecy, was undeniable. And then she felt it, a subtle change in the magic, a whispering pulse through the circle, almost like a heartbeat that was not hers. Her breath caught. The shadow binding was awakening fully, responding to their bond. Cale's gaze met hers. "Whatever comes next," he said softly, "we face it together." Lyra nodded, aware that her choice had led her here. That fate had entwined her life with the immortal kings in ways she could never undo. She did not know what the binding would demand, or how much of herself she would have to give. But in that moment, standing beside him in the glowing circle of runes, she felt a strange certainty. They would face it together. And yet, as shadows flickered along the edges of the chamber, Lyra could not shake the warning that had echoed in her visions. The true cost of the shadow binding had yet to reveal itself, and when it did, it would test not only their courage, but the strength of the fragile bond that had begun to form between them. The Alpha King waited silently, his presence both a promise and a challenge, as the magic pulsed around them, alive, watching, and waiting for the next step. The storm of shadow and heart had only just begun. The castle of Veloria had changed since Lyra Serath entered it. Where once it had been a place of cold shadows and silent halls, it now pulsed with the quiet tension of magic and the heartbeat of a bond forming between mortal and king. Yet beneath the growing connection, danger lingered. The shadow binding had begun, but the true trials were only starting. The throne room was empty that morning, save for Cale, Veyron, and Lyra. Outside, the court stirred with whispers. Rumors spread like wildfire. The mortal seer had entered the Alpha King's circle. Some spoke in awe, others in fear. Nobles exchanged worried glances, uncertain if this bond would protect or destroy the kingdom. Cale paced near the high windows, black cloak brushing the polished stone floor. "They watch us," he said, his voice calm yet edged with steel. "The court, the realm, even the shadows themselves, all are waiting to see if this bond will strengthen or break." Lyra stood in the middle of the room, her hands clasped tightly. "I can feel it too," she said softly. "The magic, the whispers. It's not just the binding, it's the entire kingdom watching, waiting for a mistake." Kale stopped and turned to her, the shadow of a smile brushing his lips. "Then we must not falter," he said. "But remember this, Lyra, the shadow binding is not only a trial of magic, it tests hearts and trust. If we fail, the consequences will reach far beyond these walls." Their eyes met, and for a moment the power and fear dissolved into something quieter, almost tender. Lyra felt it in her chest, the dangerous pull toward him, the need to understand him, to connect despite the warnings. Kale, too, showed a rare softness, a glimpse of the man beneath the king, beneath the armor and the legends. Before she could reply, the air shimmered, a ripple of darkness that heralded something unnatural. Lyra stiffened. The binding had awakened other forces, specters from the palace crypts, restless spirits of Kale's ancestors who had never fully left the mortal world. "They sense the bond," Kale said, voice low and tense. "The shadow binding is powerful. It calls to things beyond the living. We must be careful." Lyra felt a cold pressure on her chest, fear crawling along her spine. She had seen spirits in her visions, but none like these, ancient, angry, tied to Kale's bloodline and the kingdom's past. They were not mere ghosts. They were reminders of every failure, every betrayal, every broken throne. The first apparition appeared at the far end of the room, a figure cloaked in shadow, face hidden beneath a hood. Its voice was a whisper that seemed to come from every direction. "The king has broken bonds before, will this one last?" Kale stepped forward, his presence commanding. "You will not interfere," he said firmly. "The bond is ours. Leave now or be bound to consequences you cannot survive." The specter wavered, then dissolved into mist, leaving a chill in its wake. Lyra shivered but stood tall. "These spirits, why do they care?" she asked, her voice trembling. "They remember," Kale said quietly. "They remember the failures of the past. They test me to see if I am still the king who can endure or the immortal man who has lost everything." Lyra thought of the shadow binding and the connection between them. She understood now that it was not only a test of her courage, but a challenge for Kale as well. The magic revealed truths they could not hide, even from themselves. Hours passed in a tense dance of magic, whispers, and shadows. Lyra and Kale moved together, their actions guided by the pulsing energy of the binding. Each step required trust, each touch demanded courage. Every glance, every heartbeat between them grew heavier with unspoken emotion. During a brief pause, Lyra found herself sitting near a tall window, looking out over the forests beyond the cliffs. "Kale," she said softly, "I never realized how much this kingdom weighs on you." "I thought kings were only power and pride, but—" she trailed off, unsure of how to finish. Kale joined her, standing close, his shadow stretching along the wall. "I am not only a king," he said quietly. "I am a man who has carried centuries of mistakes and loss. I fear failing again. That is why the shadow binding, why you matter more than anyone could imagine." Lyra felt a pang in her chest. His words were not boasts nor demands, they were confessions. For the first time, she saw the truth beneath the legend. A man who could command armies and magic, yet still feared loneliness and the fragility of trust. "I never wanted this bond," she whispered, "but now I think I understand why it's needed. Not just for the kingdom, but for you too." Kale's gaze softened, and he reached out, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. "And I understand, Lyra, that even in my immortality I am capable of change, but change is difficult even for a king. That is why we must face the next trial together." The warning came as a sudden chill in the room, the shadows twisting faster, almost alive. The spirits had returned, stronger and more determined. One wove itself into the air, forming the shape of a massive black wolf with eyes like burning embers. Its growl resonated through the stone floor, shaking Lyra's bones. Kale stepped in front of her, drawing a blade forged from obsidian. "Stay behind me," he commanded. "These are not ordinary spirits. They are bound to the failures of my line. They will test both our courage and our bond." Lyra watched as Kale fought, not with brute force, but with careful precision, his movements a mix of strength and magic. Every strike, every gesture, pulsed with the energy of the shadow binding. She felt the connection between them strengthen, not only as a magical bond, but as an emotional one. She understood his intentions before he spoke, and he could sense her courage in return. When the spirit finally dissolved into mist, Lyra felt her legs weaken. Kale caught her, steadying her against his chest. "You are stronger than you believe," he said softly. "The shadow binding recognizes that. So do I." Lyra looked up at him, her pulse still racing. I don't know if I could do this without you." Kale's eyes softened. "And yet you are doing it despite fear. That is why the bond will survive. But understand this, Lyra. The next trial will test not just courage, but the heart. We will face truths about ourselves that may frighten us both." She nodded, absorbing the weight of his words. The bond was more than magic. It was a reflection of their souls, their choices, and their fears. Every challenge, every vision, every spirit was a lesson, not just for survival, but for understanding, trust, and perhaps something deeper. As the day wore on, Kale led her through the palace halls, preparing for the next stage of the ritual. They practiced aligning their thoughts, their emotions, and their will. Every step strengthened the connection between them, yet also revealed the fragility of the mortal heart in the presence of immortal power. "Kale," Lyra asked as they paused in a quiet courtyard, "what happens if we fail?" Kale's jaw tightened. "Failure is not an option we can afford, but if it happens, the consequences will not be limited to us. The kingdom, the people, even the very magic of Veloria will suffer." Lyra shivered, realizing the enormity of what they faced. The shadow binding was not just a personal trial. It was a responsibility that stretched beyond their own lives. And yet, even in the face of such danger, she felt a strange exhilaration. She was part of something greater, something that demanded courage and heart. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the obsidian spires, Kale led her to a chamber filled with glowing runes and a reflective pool of water. "The next trial begins now," he said. "You must confront your fears in their purest form. The shadow binding will show us not what we wish to see, but what we need to see." Lyra stepped forward, heart pounding. The water reflected not her image, but visions of the future, twisting and turning with shadows and light. She saw moments of joy and sorrow, trust and betrayal, courage and fear. And in the midst of it all, Kale appeared, not as a king, but as a man, vulnerable and real. Her breath caught. The shadow binding was teaching them, testing them, shaping the bond that was forming. She realized that their hearts were entwined not only by magic, but by choice. Each glance, each touch, each shared fear built a connection neither could ignore. Suddenly, the visions shifted violently. Lyra saw herself trapped within shadows, unable to move as Kale reached out to her but could not touch her. Panic surged through her chest, her pulse quickened, and she cried out. Kale's hand found hers instantly, grounding her, and the shadows recoiled. "You must not falter," he said, voice steady despite the tension. "Fear is natural, but it cannot control you. Trust me, trust us." Lyra's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, feeling the truth of his words. The shadow binding demanded courage, yes, but also trust, and she trusted him. She trusted that even in the darkest shadows, they could face the trials together. And yet, even as relief and determination surged through her, a whisper of warning lingered at the edges of her mind. The trials were not over. The shadow binding had many layers, and some truths were still hidden, waiting to test their hearts, their courage, and the fragile bond that was forming between mortal and king. As Kale led her back to the throne room, the night settled over Veloria, silent and watchful. The castle seemed alive, aware of the bond forming within its walls. Lyra knew that tomorrow would bring new trials, new visions, and perhaps new dangers. But she also knew that she would not face them alone. Kale's hand brushed against hers once more, a simple touch that carried weight beyond words. "No matter what comes next," he said quietly, "we face it together." Lyra's heart swelled, and for the first time since her arrival, she allowed herself to feel hope. A bond had begun, forged in magic, courage, and trust. And though the shadows still whispered warnings, she knew one thing with certainty. She and the Alpha King were entwined, and neither darkness nor destiny could break that connection. The night deepened, and in the quiet of the palace, both mortal and king prepared for the trials yet to come. The shadow binding was far from complete, and the echoes of broken thrones still whispered in the shadows. But together they had taken the first step, and that step had changed everything. The dawn broke slowly over the blackened towers of Veloria, spilling pale gold light across the jagged cliffs. Inside the castle, the air was heavy with magic, tension, and anticipation. The shadow binding had reached its final stage, and the bond between Lyra Sarath and Kale Veyron was at its peak. Neither of them had slept, and neither could afford rest. Tonight, the fate of the kingdom and their own hearts would be decided. Lyra stood in the heart of the throne room, the runes glowing beneath her feet. Each symbol pulsed with a light that reflected the rhythm of her own heartbeat. The air shimmered, almost alive, as if the palace itself were aware of the power being forged within its walls. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past trials, the spirits they had faced, and the visions that had tested her courage and trust. Cale approached her from the shadows, his cloak brushing the stone floor. Even after centuries, he moved with the silent authority of a king, but there was something softer now, something human in the way he held himself near her. His eyes, dark as midnight, reflected not just power but vulnerability, and a longing that mirrored her own. "Are you ready?" he asked quietly, his voice steady yet layered with emotion. Lyra nodded, her pulse quickening. "I am. Whatever comes, we face it together." Cale's gaze softened. "Together," he repeated, and for a moment the centuries of loneliness that had hardened him seemed to melt away. He extended his hand. Lyra took it, feeling the warmth of his life pulse through her, stronger than any magic she had ever known. The first test of the final stage came immediately. Shadows erupted from the runes beneath their feet, forming shapes both familiar and terrifying. She saw visions of Cale's past, moments of betrayal by those he trusted, the loss of those he loved, the burden of immortality crushing him into silence and isolation. And intertwined with these visions were her own fears, failing the bond, losing herself, and being unable to save him or the kingdom. Cale held her hand tighter. "Do not fear what you see," he said. "The shadow binding reveals truth, not lies. Face it, and you grow stronger. Face it with me, and we endure it together." Lyra nodded, closing her eyes. She could feel the shadows pressing against her mind, twisting memories, fears, and doubts into sharp, cold forms. Yet Cale's heartbeat, steady and powerful, anchored her. With every pulse, she felt courage returning, hope threading through the darkness. "Look at me," he whispered, and she obeyed. "Trust the bond and trust yourself. We do not need to hide from fear. It is what we overcome that defines us." The shadows recoiled slightly at the strength of their combined will. Lyra felt the magic of the shadow binding surge, lifting her spirits and intertwining her essence with Cale's in ways both frightening and beautiful. Every glance, every breath, every heartbeat became a shared rhythm. The bond was no longer just magic. It was understanding, trust, and something deeper that neither of them could name. Suddenly, a new force entered the chamber. The spirits of the royal crypts, angered and restless, manifested in full. One by one, figures of the past rose from shadow, each more imposing than the last. Their faces were twisted in sorrow and rage, their voices echoing through the hall like wind through stone. Cale stepped in front of Lyra, shielding her with his presence. "They test us still," he said, eyes flashing with determination. "We do not fight for ourselves alone. The kingdom, the people, even the magic itself depends on this bond." Lyra drew in a deep breath. "Then we will face them together." The spirits surged forward, a wave of shadow and anger. Lyra felt the pull of fear, the weight of doubt, and the memories of every trial pressing on her. But Cale's hand held hers, grounding her, and she drew strength from him. Together they moved as one, their motions synchronized, their emotions intertwined. Cale's magic flowed through the runes, casting light into the darkness. Lyra mirrored him, her own newfound courage shaping the energy of the bond. The shadows faltered as the power of their combined will pressed against them. Every strike, every gesture, every heartbeat was a declaration. They would not be broken. As the last spirit dissolved into mist, Lyra felt her knees weaken, and Cale caught her, holding her close. "You are incredible," he said softly, "not because of magic alone, but because of your heart." Her chest heaved, a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. "And you," she said quietly, "are more than the king everyone fears. You're human, you feel, you care. That is what matters." Cale smiled faintly, a rare softness in his gaze. "And yet the shadow binding is not complete. One final trial remains. We must show the courage to sacrifice, not our hearts, but the fears that hold us back. Only then can we claim the bond fully." Lyra nodded. She had faced fear, shadows, and visions, but this trial would ask more than courage alone. It would demand trust, vulnerability, and the willingness to let their hearts be intertwined without reservation. The final trial was silent at first. The runes pulsed with a soft golden light, and the shadows of the past began to swirl around them, forming shapes that reflected their deepest fears. Lyra saw herself lost, trapped in darkness, unable to move, while Cale watched helplessly. Kale saw centuries of solitude, the weight of immortal power, and the possibility of losing Lyra forever. But instead of panic, they held each other's gaze. "Together," Kale whispered, "no matter what." Lyra felt the bond respond. The shadows pressed harder, but the connection between them was stronger than any fear. With each heartbeat, each shared breath, the shadows weakened, dissolving into the light of trust and courage. Their bond became a shield, a force that no past failure, no vision, no ghost could overcome. Hours seemed to pass in a single heartbeat. And then, as the first rays of true sunlight broke over the cliffs of Veloria, the final shadow dissolved. The runes dimmed, the air settled, and a quiet, almost holy peace filled the throne room. Lyra stood, trembling but unbroken. Kale's hand remained in hers, steady and warm. Their eyes met, and in that glance was the understanding of everything they had endured, the trials, the visions, the spirits, and the growing, unspoken bond of hearts and souls intertwined. We did it," Lyra whispered. "The shadow binding, it's complete." Kale nodded, a rare smile brushing his lips. "Yes, but it was never only about the magic. It was about courage, trust, and understanding. And you have shown more strength than any king or immortal could ever hope for." Lyra felt a warmth bloom in her chest, a mixture of relief, pride, and something far more tender. "And you," she said softly, "have shown me that even someone like you can be more than fear and legend. You can be hope." Kale's eyes softened, and he lowered himself to her level, their foreheads touching. "And you," he whispered, "have shown me that trust and courage can redeem even the darkest hearts. Together we are stronger than shadows, stronger than prophecy, stronger than fear." The castle seemed to sigh, as if recognizing the bond that had formed. The shadows that had haunted the halls receded completely, leaving light in their place. The kingdom itself seemed to breathe again, the magic of Veloria responding to the union of mortal and immortal, trust and courage, heart and will. Lyra stepped closer, resting her hand against Kale's chest. She felt the steady rhythm of his heart beneath her palm, alive and real. "What now?" she asked quietly. Kale smiled, a warmth that had been absent for centuries radiating from him. "Now," he said, "we live, not as king and seer, not as ruler and subject, but as partners. The bond is ours to nurture, to protect, and to honor. Together we shape the future, not as prophecy dictates, but as we choose." Lyra's eyes shimmered with tears of joy and relief. She had faced the shadows, endured the visions, and survived the trials. And in doing so, she had found something she had never expected, a connection that was stronger than fear, stronger than power, stronger than destiny itself. Kale took her hand and led her to the balcony overlooking the kingdom. The sun rose fully now, casting gold light over forests, cliffs, and rivers. The world of Veloria stretched before them, alive and vibrant, no longer held hostage by shadows or prophecy. Together they watched the dawn, hearts intertwined, knowing that whatever trials might come in the future, they would face them as one. The shadow binding had ended, but their story, their connection, and the redemption of both their hearts had only just begun. The Alpha King and the mortal seer stood side by side, a symbol of courage, trust, and the power of hearts united. And in the quiet brilliance of the new day, Veloria breathed anew, ready for a future shaped not by fear or legend, but by love, understanding, and the strength of two souls bound together. The kingdom was safe. The shadows had receded. And though echoes of the past lingered in quiet corners, they no longer held power over what Kale and Lyra had built. As the sun climbed higher, Lyra leaned against Kale, her hand still in his. "Whatever comes next," she whispered, "we face it together." Kale's smile was gentle, filled with centuries of hope and newfound joy. "Together," he echoed, and the world seemed to agree, shining brighter than it had in generations. The shadow binding was complete, the trials were over. And in their hearts, both mortal and king knew one truth above all. Courage, trust, and love could reshape destiny itself.